Alright, welcome to our brief lecture talking about methods of transportation for industrial development. I stole the slides from a guy named David Palmer who works out of Eagle Crest High School in Colorado. I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for today's lecture. A quick note about format, which might influence how you take notes. On each slide, let me go ahead and show you. What you're going to see is the type of transportation, and then you're going to see some pros, and you're going to see some cons, and that's really what we're going to talk about. Then you'll also have a picture to help illustrate it. So when you're going through and taking your notes, it might be useful just to take two-column notes, basically in a table format. Have one side be pro and one side be con, and then down the left-hand side just list the different types of transportation. So, starting to dig into it, the first type of transportation we're going to talk about is air transportation, right? And air transportation has a lot of really good things going for it. Okay, it's very fast. Doesn't take very long to fly products from one place to another. It's very secure. It's much harder for hijackers, for instance, or for thieves to steal stuff because there's just fewer points at which goods are out. It's great and really awesome if we're talking about things like fresh foods. They're things that need to be moved from one place, from the source to the market, very, very quickly. Okay, so for instance, the bananas from Argentina or wherever they grow bananas in South America, those they tend to fly because they need to get them from one place to another very, very quickly. Okay, some of the cons, some of the negatives. It's very, very expensive to ship things by air. That's why, for instance, if you go to the post office and you say you want to ship something parcel post, which means you're putting it on a truck, it takes a lot longer, but it also costs roughly 25% of first class shipping, right? Air travel, it's also got a smaller tonnage of cargo, so there's less space in the plane, even in cargo planes, to ship stuff than there are, say, for instance, on the big ships. And speaking of big ships, we talk about container ships or barges, right? And the picture we've got here is a great illustration of what one of those container ships look like. And you can see what it's really got is just literally those great big containers that you see on the back of semi-trucks, just stacked up. And depending on the ship will depend on how deep they're stacked and how many are on the deck. But they can stack a lot of cargo on and in those ships. Okay, so it's very inexpensive in large part because the unit price is so little, right? The more stuff you can put into a type of shipping, the less money each item costs, and this holds a whole lot of stuff. It's also good because the containers can be transported to and from the boats to trucks or trains really easily. Literally, they just put them on cranes and drop them down. Okay, so it's inexpensive. You can ship a lot of stuff. Most freight in the world, by the way, when it goes overseas, goes by container ships. Okay, and it's easy when you hit that break of bulk point to move it from the ship to a different type of transportation. Some of the cons. It's very, very slow. It can take days or even weeks, potentially, for items to get from one place to another. Okay. It's way better than it used to be, obviously, since we're using motorboats and not sailboats. But it's still, especially compared to planes, very, very slow. You run the distinct risk of piracy, especially depending on where you're at in the world and how secure the waters are. Right? So, for instance, not quite as much now, but for a long time, right off of the Horn of Africa by Somalia, it's a huge piracy problem. There's still a little bit of a problem, but not nearly as bad as it used to be. Where literally you'd get these pirates who would come up and take control of the ship, okay? And then they would ransom the ship off. One of the cons of this is that you can only use it where there's water as well, right? Container ships only really work, and when we say water, by the way, what we're talking about are oceans. We don't send container ships up and down rivers, right? You won't find a container ship on the Columbia or the Mississippi or something like that, okay? These are open water, ocean port kind of ships. Okay? So there's limits to where they can go, which is also kind of a con. Another type of ship that often gets used and works really well when we're talking about certain types of freight are oil tankers. Obviously, we use them for oil, right? And these we don't stack containers up on the top like what you saw in the previous slide, but what we do is all the freight goes into the bottom of the ship. And in essence, what it does is it helps to serve as ballast. Okay. The trick with this is, of course, if you run into something, this could be a huge problem, as we find out almost every time there's a major oil spill, right? It also makes the cargo very, very valuable and easy to siphon off small amounts. So just something to consider, right? And also oil tankers tend to move slow. So we're transporting liquids in particular, like I said, in particular crude oil, from one place to another. Oil tankers are the way to go, and there's some ways that they obviate and try to cut down on the likelihood of problems. So for instance, you'll notice in our diagram where there's empty space at both the beginning, both the front and the back of the ship. And then there's also a double hull. That double hull, by the way, goes all the way up the sides. To try and make sure that if the worst case scenario happens, that we're not spilling oil. You'll also notice that the oil is in tanked rooms, and each of those rooms has its own wall, so they can actually shut off parts of the ship and shut off access to those rooms. If worst case scenario, they had a hole in the bottom of one of the rooms or something like that, they could limit the amount of oil that gets out. So moving on, though, talking about other types of transportation. Next type I want to talk about are trains, right? My son's favorite method of transportation, by the way. And trains have a lot of really good things about them, right? They're relatively inexpensive. They can carry large quantities of cargo. They're comparatively easy on the environment. Okay. But there's also some really bad things. So first of all, they're fixed destinations, meaning trains only go where there are rails to go. Okay. So they only go to certain places, and not everywhere in the world has equal quality track. Okay. And then, speaking of track, you come across the issue of maintaining the track. So you've got to maintain not just the metal rails on top, but also the cross ties underneath. You've got to make sure that they're not blocked, right? Since we live in the Pacific Northwest in the Puget Sound region, probably once every 2-3 weeks, something like that, if you pay attention to the news, you'll hear that the Sounder train is blocked, right? Sounder's a commuter train, but the same principle applies. What's happened is there's been a landslide up north, and now the tracks are blocked, so people can't get through on the train, right? Same thing holds for cargo trains. We've got to maintain the tracks. We've got to make sure that the tracks are clear, that they're in good shape, right? And that the trains are able to get through. Another method of transportation, and this works especially well for liquids, and we see it primarily with liquids and gases, a lot of times oil, for instance, are pipes. So if you've ever seen a pipeline, it's quite the thing to see. Some of the pros, they carry large quantities of cargo. They're relatively inexpensive. You build it, you maintain it, but you don't have a lot of labor costs or things like that go into it, right? They work really, really well for liquids and gases. Okay. Some of our cons, of course, that you've got fixed destinations, so the pipes go where the pipes go, and if you want to take it anywhere else, you got to put it on a different method of transportation. Okay. Maintaining those pipes can potentially be expensive, because I know, for instance, back home up in Alaska, with the Great Alaska Pipeline, we literally, during hunting season, every year you hear about people who shot a hole in the pipeline, and now there's oil spurting out somewhere along the way, right? So then not only they have to shut down the pipeline, or at least part of it, they have to patch it and fix it, or replace the segment, most likely replace it, but then they've got costs in terms of the downtime, they've got cost in terms of the replacement, but they've also got costs in terms of cleaning up the environment. And so those are all things that need to be considered when we're talking about pipelines and about pipeline maintenance. Pretty sure this is our last slide here. So we talk about sending things via truck on the road, and this is probably the most popular way, certainly here in the U.S., to ship stuff. Is so some of the pros. It's very, very flexible. Trucks can go almost anywhere, right? You see cargo trucks driving all around Seattle all the time. You see them on the freeway. You see them in small towns. And that's especially when we're talking about shorter trips. It's very, very quick comparatively, right? And it literally can go to a door in a way that trains can't and planes can't, and things like that. And that's why oftentimes the last segment of transportation will be on a truck. Okay? But some of the downsides, right? Trucks have smaller capacities. You have the cost of gas, which fluctuates. So right now it's down, right? It's down to, I don't know, $2.50 a gallon, give or take. Here in the Puget Sound, last I looked. But it could be as high as there are points where it was actually almost upwards of almost $5 a gallon. So you've got fluctuating costs there in a way you don't have as much trouble with some of the other ones. You've also got the cost of the driver, right? And truck drivers are not cheap to pay. They make a pretty decent living. And depending on how far you want them to go, right, technically, like everybody else, they can only work about 8 hours a day. So if you need them to take a 10 or a 12-hour drive, now you're not only paying them for the time they're on the road, but you may also very well be paying for them to stay overnight somewhere, right? And hotels aren't cheap, paying for meals and things like that as part of the trip. So this has been our lecture talking about methods of transportation and industrial development and some of the pros and the cons. We looked at air travel, we looked at trains, we looked at boats and container ships, we talked about pipelines, we talked about trucks and other vehicles, and looked at what are, again, some of the pros, some of the cons of each of those methods of transportation. If you have questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just go ahead and come see me with those during class, and I'll look forward to answering any questions you have.